She thought that her late husband had left her only debts, an old house, and a rusty shed on the edge of the field in the Altai region. For the neighbors it was just a pile of metal, and for the bank it was a useless patch of land that would soon be taken for debts. But before his death Thomas Thompson left his wife one strange thing. An old brass key and a short note that read, "Open it when the world becomes too dark." When Eleanor Thompson inserted the key into the lock of the rusty door, the metal groaned as if it had not been opened for decades. The door slowly slid aside and the smell of oil, steel, and old memories filled the air. What was hidden under the dusty tarp inside this forgotten shed turned out to be not just a car. It was a secret her husband had worked on for 40 years, and this secret was worth more than $1 million. But even more important, it was proof that true love can protect you even after death. The cold wind came down from the mountains of Altai, carrying the scent of dry grass and the approaching winter. Gray skies hung over the small farm like a heavy lid on an old chest. Eleanor Thompson stood at the window of her wooden house and looked out at the fields that had once been full of life. She was 67 years old, a small woman with a slender figure slightly stooped from years of hard work. Her gray hair, once thick and chestnut brown, was now gathered in a simple bun at the back of her head. Her face was covered with fine wrinkles not from age but from endless worries and the winds that had swept across these fields for decades. In her hands she held an envelope of thick paper with a bank seal. She had already read the letter 3 times but still unfolded it again. It was a notice of property seizure. 30 days until the land would be taken. 30 days. Only 1 month to leave the house where she had lived for nearly half her life. Eleanor slowly sat down on the chair by the kitchen table. The wood creaked softly. It was the very table her husband Thomas Thompson had once made. The name echoed in her mind like a whisper. He had died exactly 1 year and 3 days earlier. A strong, broad-shouldered man with the rough face of a mechanic and kind eyes. Once his thick black beard had made him look like an old Russian hero, and his loud laugh could chase away any silence. Thomas had always been fixing something. Tractors, combines, old trucks. He had served as a mechanic in the army back in Soviet times, and after service he could disassemble almost any engine with his eyes closed. But 1 year earlier, at night, his heart had stopped. Eleanor had woken in the morning and reached for him only to find his hand cold. The doctor said it had been a stroke, quick and painless, but for Eleanor it felt as if half the world had been torn from under her feet. She was left alone with the farm, alone with the debts, alone with the silence. Beyond the window stretched 80 acres of land that had once been fertile. But the last 3 years the harvests had been poor. Droughts, early frosts, and falling grain prices had forced them to take loans and then more loans. Then Thomas fell ill and the bills grew like weeds. Eleanor had tried to hold on. She worked 16 hours a day, sold old machinery, cut every expense, but the debt still rose to nearly 6 million rubles. The bank had been patient for a long time, but a bank's patience is like snow in spring. It always melts. Yesterday a man from the bank had come to see her. His name was Victor Anderson, a man about 40, tall and lean with a smoothly shaved face and short blonde hair neatly combed back. He wore an expensive dark coat and polished shoes that looked completely out of place on the muddy farmyard. Victor spoke in the quiet, confident voice of a man used to being listened to. "Mrs. Thompson," he had said then, standing on the porch, "I understand how hard this is for you, but sometimes it is better to let go of the past." Eleanor had looked at him in silence. "The farm no longer brings income. Your debt exceeds the value of the land. Perhaps you should consider selling." "This is my home," she had answered quietly. He had smiled politely but coldly. Sometimes the wisest decision is to accept reality. Now his words echoed in her head. Eleanor slowly rose and walked through the house, touching things. The old cupboard, the bookshelf with car magazines, the photograph on the wall of her and Thomas on their wedding day. He had looked like a bear in a suit, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard and laughing eyes. She ran a finger over the frame. "I do not know what to do, Thomas," she whispered. There was of course no answer, only the wind outside the window. Eleanor sighed and walked to Thomas's old writing desk. She had avoided it all year, but now it was time to sort his things. She opened the top drawer. Inside lay the usual items. A watch, an old folding knife, photographs. But in the very back corner her fingers touched a small wooden box she had never seen before. Eleanor frowned. The box was simple, handmade, of dark wood with a small brass latch. She carefully opened it. Inside lay two things: an old brass key and a folded sheet of paper. Her heart suddenly beat faster. She recognized the handwriting at once. It was Thomas's, large, confident, slightly angular. Eleanor unfolded the letter. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am already gone. Forgive me for leaving you alone, but I have not left you without protection. I worked on this for nearly 40 years. The key opens the old shed at the end of the field, the very one I never let you enter. Forgive me for the secret. I simply wanted everything to be ready. Open it when the world becomes too dark. There you will find what will help you go on living. I love you always, your Thomas." Tears ran down her cheeks. She read the letter again and then once more. The shed. That very old metal shed at the edge of the land. It had always been locked. Thomas had said it held old tools and rusty metal, too dangerous. "Too many sharp iron pieces there, Eleanor dear," he used to say. She had never argued. In 42 years of marriage, he had never given her reason to doubt him. Eleanor slowly raised her eyes. Through the window she could see the shed, a small building of rusty corrugated iron. The roof sagged slightly and the windows were boarded up. It looked as if it might collapse at any moment. "What on earth did you hide there?" she whispered. Eleanor gripped the key tightly. The sun was already setting. The sky was darkening and the cold was growing stronger, but inside her a strange spark suddenly appeared. Hope, fragile and almost forgotten. She put on her old coat and walked out of the house. The grass crunched under her feet from the frost. The shed looked even more pitiful up close. Rust ran down the walls in orange streaks. On the door hung a heavy old padlock. Eleanor inserted the key. It fitted perfectly. Click. The lock opened. She removed it with trembling hands and then pulled the door. At first it would not move, then the metal groaned. The screech echoed across the empty field. The door slowly slid aside. From inside came the smell of oil, metal, and old dust. Eleanor switched on the flashlight on her phone. The beam cut through the darkness. Dust particles swirled in the air. And then she saw it, right in the center of the shed. A huge shape covered with a heavy tarp. The form was long and low, like a car. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. What had Thomas hidden here for 40 years? She took a step forward and slowly reached out to the edge of the tarp. The cold wind crept through the cracks of the old shed and the weak beam of the flashlight trembled in Eleanor's hands. She stood motionless for several seconds. Before her rose a long silhouette under the heavy tarp. The shape was too smooth, too neat for an old tractor or farm equipment. Eleanor's heart beat faster. "What did you hide there, Thomas?" she whispered quietly. Her fingers touched the edge of the tarp. The fabric was rough and cold, covered with a thick layer of dust. She pulled it slowly as if afraid to frighten away her own hope. The tarp slid away and the flashlight beam glided over the smooth surface of metal. Eleanor gasped. Before her stood an automobile. Not just any automobile, a real old magnificent one. It was long and low like a predator ready to spring. The body shone with a deep dark cherry color despite the layer of dust. Chrome details softly reflected the light of the flashlight. It was a car that looked as if it belonged to an entirely different world. Eleanor slowly walked around it. Her footsteps echoed in the empty shed. She knew almost nothing about expensive cars, but even she could see this one was extraordinary. On the front grille gleamed the emblem of a seagull. Eleanor frowned. She had heard the name before. In Soviet times such cars had been rare. They were not sold to ordinary people. They were given to party officials, generals, and high-ranking state guests. And now one of those automobiles stood in her shed. Good Lord. She breathed. She carefully ran her hand over the body. The metal was cold and smooth. Eleanor approached the door and gently pulled it. The door opened quietly and softly as if the mechanism had been oiled only yesterday. The flashlight lit up the interior. Leather seats of deep cream color, a wooden steering wheel, a dashboard like that of an old aeroplane. Even the smell inside the car was special. A mixture of leather, machine oil, and old metal. She suddenly felt a strange sensation as if she had stepped into someone else's life, a life she knew nothing about. Eleanor closed the door and turned to the workbench against the wall. Only now did she notice that the shed was not at all the chaos Thomas had always described. Tools hung on the wall in perfectly even rows. Every wrench and screwdriver had its place. It looked like a master craftsman's workshop, not a junkyard. On the table lay a thick folder. Eleanor picked it up. Dust rose into the air. She opened the folder. The first document was an old sheet of paper with a seal. Eleanor read aloud almost in a whisper. Purchase agreement, 1978. Her eyes widened.
Gastiertin Sheka.
Buyer, Thomas Thompson. Purchase price, 9,000 rubles. That had been a huge sum for those times. Eleanor sank onto the old stool. She leafed through the documents, photographs, invoices, receipts. On the old yellowed snapshots was Thomas, young and strong with thick dark hair and a beard. In one photograph he stood next to the bare metal frame of the car, smiling broadly like a boy who had found treasure. On the back of the photograph was an inscription in his handwriting. 1979. The beginning. One day this will save Eleanor. Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest. She continued turning pages. Each page told a story. 1983. Engine restoration. 1991. Search for original parts. 1999. Reupholstering seats in genuine leather. 2007. Complete repaint of the body. This had not been simple repairs, it had been a life that lasted 40 years. Thomas had worked on this car for almost their entire married life, secretly, quietly, at night. Eleanor suddenly remembered how many times she had heard the sound of tools from the shed, how many times he had come home late in the evening smelling of oil and metal. She had always thought he was repairing old farm equipment, but in reality he had been building her future. At the bottom of the folder lay an envelope. On it was written, "For Eleanor if you found the car." Eleanor's hands trembled. She opened the letter. The handwriting was familiar. "My Eleanor, if you are reading this letter, then my plan has finally come to light. I bought this Chaika in 1978. At the time it was almost falling apart. I knew one thing. Cars like this do not disappear from history. Over time they only become more valuable. I decided to restore it not as a hobby but as insurance for you. Every bolt, every detail is years of my work. I did it slowly so no one would notice. One day this car will be worth more than $1 million. If that day comes and I am no longer beside you, sell it. It is your freedom. And in the box you will also find letters. I wrote them for you for your future birthdays over the next 15 years. I do not know how much time we are given, but I wanted my voice to stay with you always. Your Thomas." Eleanor closed her eyes. Tears flowed down her face. She raised her head and looked at the automobile. "You were crazy," she whispered through her tears. 40 years. 40 years he had worked on this. Eleanor opened the folder again. Inside there really was a small box. She opened it. There were 15 envelopes. Each bore a date. Her future birthdays, 68, 69, 70, 71. Eleanor ran a finger over the top envelope. Her heart clenched. He had known he might not live long, and yet he had written letters, so she would never feel alone. Eleanor slowly stood up. She looked again at the car, at its shining body and powerful lines. She suddenly understood. Thomas had not simply repaired a car, he had built a shield between her and future troubles. And now that shield stood before her, quiet, powerful, waiting. But one question would not leave her alone. If this car was really worth so much, why had Thomas never told her about it? Eleanor looked at the automobile once more, and suddenly it seemed that in the silence of the shed she could almost hear her husband's voice as if he were still watching her, waiting for her to understand his secret to the end. Night fell over the Altai farm quietly and slowly like a dark blanket covering the tired earth. Eleanor Thompson was still sitting on the old stool in the shed. The flashlight lay on the table illuminating the folder with documents, the letters, and the long line of the automobile standing in the middle of the workshop. The silence around her was thick, but inside Eleanor everything was roaring. She took the first envelope from the box of letters again. On it was written, "For Eleanor on her 68th birthday." This was her current age. Her fingers slowly opened the envelope. Thomas's handwriting was as confident as ever. She began to read. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this letter, then you have found the Chaika. I do not know how much time has passed. Maybe a year, maybe more, but if you are sitting here now beside this car, then the moment has come when it should help you. There is one request. Before you sell it, start the engine. I want you to hear that sound. It is the sound of all the years of my work. It is the sound of your future. Do not try to drive. Just start it and listen. I am sure you will understand. I love you, your Thomas. Tears flowed down Eleanor's cheeks again. She closed the letter and pressed it to her chest. You always thought of everything, she whispered. She rose and walked to the car. Inside the cabin, everything looked as if Thomas had finished the work only yesterday. On the dashboard lay a small metal key. She immediately understood. The ignition key. Eleanor opened the door and carefully sat in the driver's seat. The leather creaked softly under her. Her hands trembled. She had never driven such cars. Honestly, she had hardly driven at all. But right now that did not matter. She inserted the key. For several seconds, she simply sat there. The silence was almost sacred. Eleanor turned the key. First there was a quiet click, then a short whir of the starter, and suddenly the engine exploded with a powerful roar. A deep, heavy sound filled the entire shed. It was low like the rumble of distant thunder. The walls shook and dust rose from the floor. Eleanor shuddered, but a second later her lips trembled into a smile. The engine ran evenly, strongly, alive. The sound was so powerful it seemed the car itself was breathing. Good Lord. She whispered. And suddenly she had a strange feeling, as if Thomas were standing somewhere nearby, leaning against the wall as he often had, arms crossed on his chest, looking at her and smiling his calm, slightly ironic smile. That sound really was the sound of his work. 40 years of labor, 40 years of patience, 40 years of love. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the engine run for a few seconds. Then she carefully turned the key back. Silence returned to the shed, but now it no longer seemed so empty. Eleanor slowly got out of the car. Her heart was still pounding. She walked back to the table and opened the folder again. Now she wanted to know more. At the bottom of the folder lay a thin notebook. On the cover was written, History of the Automobile. Eleanor opened it. On the first page was the name Alexander Gordon. Beneath it was an old black and white photograph. A man stood beside this very Chaika. He was tall and strong with sharp features and short dark hair. On his face was the confident smile of a man used to speed. He wore a racing suit. Eleanor read the caption. Alexander Gordon, racing driver, champion of the USSR in circuit racing, 1966. She turned the page. It turned out this Chaika had once belonged to him. After an accident at the end of the 60s, the car had disappeared, and for nearly 40 years nothing had been known about it. Eleanor gave a quiet whistle. So you knew what you were doing, she said. The folder contained even more documents. Newspaper clippings, archive photographs, lists of parts. Thomas had not simply restored the car, he had restored its history. Now Eleanor began to understand. This car was not merely rare, it was a legend. And if Thomas had been right, it could be worth enormous money. But how to find out exactly? Eleanor returned to the house. The kitchen was cold. She switched on the old laptop. The computer took a long time to load. Finally, the internet appeared. Eleanor slowly typed into the search. Gas 13 Chaika price for collectors. Results appeared almost immediately. She began to read. One auction, another, articles, collector forums. The figures made her heart stop. $700,000, $900,000, $1.1 million. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand. It was impossible. But she read further and suddenly saw a familiar name. Irene Brooks. The article said she was an expert on Soviet collector cars and curator of the automobile department at a museum in St. Petersburg. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time, then opened her email. Her fingers slowly typed. Hello, my name is Eleanor Thompson. My husband died 1 year ago and left me an automobile, a Gas 13 Chaika. He restored it for about 40 years. I found the documents and the history of the car. I do not know what to do next. Could you look at the photographs and tell me how valuable it is? She attached several shots from the folder and pressed send. Eleanor did not expect a quick reply. She closed the laptop and poured herself some tea. Less than 20 minutes passed. The computer gave a quiet ping. New mail. She opened it. The answer was short. Eleanor Thompson, if the automobile is really the one you describe, then it is one of the most mysterious cars of Soviet motorsport. Alexander Gordon's Chaika has been considered missing for more than 40 years. I must see it in person. I am flying to Altai tomorrow morning. Irene Brooks. Eleanor slowly lowered her hands. Her heart began to beat faster again. So Thomas had been right. But one question still would not leave her alone. If this car was really so valuable, who else might learn about it, and what would happen when rumors began to spread? Morning over the Altai steppe was clear and cold. The sun rose slowly, coloring the fields with pale gold, but the air still smelled of the approaching winter. Eleanor Thompson woke early. She had hardly slept that night. Thoughts swirled in her head. The Chaika, Thomas's letters, Irene Brooks's reply, and most of all the possible value of the automobile. She brewed tea and sat by the window. The shed was visible from the porch, old, rusty, almost falling down. But now Eleanor knew that inside it was not junk. There stood a car capable of changing her life. She had only just raised the cup to her lips when she heard the sound of an engine. Along the gravel road, a black off-road vehicle slowly approached the house. Eleanor frowned. The car stopped at the gate. The door opened. Out stepped a familiar man. Victor Anderson. He looked as neat as always. Tall, with a narrow face and thin lips. His fair hair was carefully combed back and his gray expensive coat fitted perfectly, as if he had just stepped out of a Moscow office rather than driven to a farm. But today there was something new in his eyes. Curiosity and calculation. He walked to the porch. "Good morning, Eleanor." His voice sounded soft, almost friendly, but Eleanor already knew that tone. It was the voice of a man who had already decided something for himself. "Good morning," she answered calmly. He glanced around. His gaze lingered on the shed. The door was slightly ajar. Victor narrowed his eyes. "Were you working in there yesterday?" he asked. "Sorting through my husband's old things," she replied. He took several steps toward the shed. "May I have a look?" Eleanor immediately felt alarm. There is nothing interesting there, but Victor had already seen. Through the crack in the door, a piece of shining chrome was visible. He stopped. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait," he said quietly. He slowly walked closer and looked inside. For several seconds he was silent, then he gave a quiet whistle. "Well, well." He turned to Eleanor. "That is a Chaika, right?" She said nothing, but that was enough. Victor smiled, but the smile was not warm. It was the smile of a man who had seen an opportunity. "Interesting find," he said. He walked inside the shed as if he already felt at home, examined the car, ran a finger along the wing. "An old automobile," he said thoughtfully. "My husband restored it," Eleanor said. "I understand," he straightened up. "But you know such cars are hard to sell. They require maintenance. Restoration is rarely perfect." He paused. "But I have collector friends. I can offer you $80,000. Eleanor slowly raised an eyebrow.
$80,000.
"That is a fair price for an old car," he said, folding his hands behind his back. "Especially considering that in 28 days the bank will take this land." The words hung in the air. He looked straight at her. "Think about it, Eleanor. That money will help you start a new life." Eleanor looked at the car, then back at Victor. "The car is not for sale." His smile vanished for a second. "Are you sure?" He shrugged. "As you wish." But before leaving he said quietly, "Time is not on your side." And he drove away. Eleanor stood on the porch for a long time. She felt anxiety growing inside her. If Victor had learned about the car, then rumors had already begun to spread. And she was not wrong. 2 days later another man arrived at the farm, this time in a white off-road vehicle with Moscow plates. Out stepped a tall man about 60. He was broad-shouldered and slightly stooped. His gray hair was cut short and thick gray mustaches gave his face a stern expression. His name was Gregory Malone. He introduced himself as a collector, but in his movements there was the caution of a man used to negotiations. He was dressed simply. A dark coat and leather gloves. But his watch cost more than all the furniture in Eleanor's house. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked. His voice was low and calm. "I heard you have an interesting automobile." Eleanor immediately understood someone had told him. "Who told you?" He smiled slightly. In the world of collectors, news travels fast. She sighed. "You may look." They entered the shed. Malone stopped in front of the car. For several seconds he simply looked, but Eleanor noticed one detail. His eyes flashed. He recognized the car's value instantly. But on his face he kept calm. He slowly walked around the automobile, tapped the wing, opened the door, looked inside, then straightened up. He thoughtfully stroked his mustache. "Not bad." Eleanor remained silent. He continued, "But the restoration, shall we say, is amateur." She felt irritation rising inside her. "My husband was a professional mechanic." "Possibly," he shrugged. "But the market is cruel." He turned to her. "I will give you $150,000 in cash." The word sounded heavy, but Eleanor suddenly felt a strange calm. She already knew the truth. "No," she said. Malone frowned slightly. "Pardon me? I am not selling the car." He looked at her attentively. "You realize I am offering you more than any dealer possibly could? And the bank will soon take your land?" She nodded. "I know." He took a step closer. "Then why do you refuse?" Eleanor looked at the Chaika, then at Malone. "Because you are lying." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Pardon me? You know perfectly well how much this car is worth." Malone was silent for several seconds, then gave a quiet chuckle. "Stubborn woman." He headed for the exit. At the door he stopped. "If you change your mind, call." He handed her a business card and left. When his car disappeared around the bend, Eleanor returned to the house. She took out an old notebook and wrote on the first page. Offers for the Chaika. First entry.
Victor Anderson, $82,000.
Second entry. Gregory Malone, $150,000. She closed the notebook and looked at the shed through the window. "I will wait, Thomas," she said quietly. "I will wait for the expert." Morning was quiet and clear. Over the Altai fields hung a cold blue mist, and the sun rose slowly from behind distant mountains, coloring the grass with silver frost. Eleanor Thompson stood at the farm gate wrapped in her old woolen coat. She had hardly slept that night. She was waiting. The plane from St. Petersburg had landed at the small regional airport early in the morning, and the woman who was supposed to come from there should arrive any minute. After some time, a silver off-road vehicle appeared on the road. The car stopped at the gate. The door opened. Out stepped Irene Brooks. She was about 45, tall and slim, with the straight posture of someone used to working in a scientific environment. Her dark hair was neatly tied in a ponytail, and her attentive gray eyes stood out on her face. Her skin was pale, almost northern, the mark of long years in St. Petersburg. She was dressed practically. A dark jacket, jeans, and leather boots. But in her movements there was the confidence of a professional. Over her shoulder hung a bag with equipment. When she came closer, Eleanor noticed in her gaze the same thing she had seen in Thomas when he looked at a complicated engine. The curiosity of a master. "Eleanor Thompson?" she asked. "Yes." "Irene Brooks." She extended her hand. The handshake was firm. "Thank you for letting me come. Thank you for coming so quickly." Irene smiled. When it concerns a car that has been considered missing for 40 years, one cannot delay. Eleanor led her to the shed. The door creaked. Sunlight fell inside. The Chaika stood where it had been before. The dark cherry body shone with a soft reflection of light. Irene stopped on the threshold. She did not even enter at once. Her eyes widened. She slowly drew in a breath. "My God." For several seconds, she simply looked, then she carefully walked closer. Her movements became almost reverent, as if she were afraid to destroy a fragile illusion. She ran her hand over the chrome, opened the door, looked at the dashboard and said quietly, "This is incredible." She turned to Eleanor. "Your husband was a genius." Eleanor felt her heart tighten. He was a mechanic. No, Irene said gently. He was a restorer of museum level. She set her bag on the table and began to take out equipment. A small torch, a magnifying glass, a special paint thickness gauge, a camera. For the next few hours Irene checked every detail of the car. She photographed part numbers, examined the engine, compared documents, measured paint thickness. Sometimes she muttered something to herself, sometimes she shook her head, sometimes she smiled. Eleanor sat on the stool and watched. She felt as if she were watching an examination on which her entire life depended. Finally Irene straightened up. She removed her glasses and looked at the car once more. I can say this with complete certainty, she said. This Chaika is one of the rarest that still exist. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. How rare. Irene opened the folder with Thomas's documents. The GAZ-13 was produced in limited numbers, she explained. But this example is special. She showed the old photograph of Alexander Gordon. The car belonged to the legendary racer and then disappeared from the archives. She raised her eyes. Until today. Eleanor gave a quiet sigh. And how much is it worth? Irene thought for a second. If sold at an international auction, she said slowly, from $1.2 to $1.5 million. Eleanor closed her eyes. The words echoed in her head. 1.5 million. It was more money than she could imagine. She opened her eyes. I knew it. Forgive me. People have already come to see me. Irene frowned. Who? Victor Anderson from the bank. Irene chuckled. And how much did he offer?
$80,000.
Irene laughed softly. A classic trick. Then there was a collector, Gregory Malone. Eleanor looked at her in surprise. You know him? Of course, Irene shook her head. He is one of the most aggressive dealers in Russia. He offered $150,000. Irene snorted. That is called lowballing. They hope the owner does not know the real price. Eleanor clenched her hands. They thought I was a desperate widow. You were, Irene said gently. But now you have information. She closed the folder. I must tell you something else. Eleanor tensed. The Museum of Automotive History in St. Petersburg. She paused for a moment. We would like to buy this car. Eleanor looked up in surprise. Buy it? Yes. Irene walked to the car and looked at it almost with respect. This Chaika is part of history. And the story of your husband is too. She turned to Eleanor. We are offering $1.3 million. The shed became quiet. Eleanor could not answer at once. Her thoughts whirled. The farm, the debts, the future, and Thomas. 40 years of work. We want to exhibit the car in the museum, Irene continued, with the story of your husband. She smiled gently. People should know what he did. Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears. He would have liked that. Think about it. Irene handed her a business card. We are ready to complete the deal quickly, but the decision must be yours. Eleanor looked at the Chaika, then at the photograph of Thomas on the wall of the shed. I need a little time. Irene nodded. Of course. She gathered her equipment. But honestly, she looked at Eleanor seriously. If rumors about the car spread, more people will come and not all of them will be honest. Eleanor looked at the car. She already knew the story was only beginning. Gray skies hung over the Altai plain and a cold wind rustled the dry grass around the old shed. 2 days had passed since Irene Brooks's visit. Eleanor Thompson had still not given a final answer. She sat in the kitchen holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. On the table lay Irene's business card and the old wooden box with Thomas's letters. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sometimes Eleanor caught herself thinking she would soon hear her husband's heavy footsteps on the porch. But every time the silence returned. She sighed and looked out the window. And immediately noticed a car on the road. A black off-road vehicle, and behind it another one. Eleanor's heart clenched. She already knew who had arrived. The cars stopped at the gate. From the first one, Victor Anderson stepped out. Today he looked less confident than usual. His gray coat was buttoned up to the collar and his face seemed tense. From the second car, Gregory Malone emerged. He walked slowly with his hands in his coat pockets. His gray mustaches twitched as he surveyed the farm. The men exchanged glances and headed toward the house. Eleanor was already standing on the porch. She did not invite them inside. "Eleanor," Victor began. His voice was polite, but there was a new hardness in it. "We have come to talk." "I am listening," she answered calmly. Malone took a step forward. His gaze was cold and attentive. "We know you contacted the museum." Eleanor was not surprised. She had expected it. Malone chuckled. "You must understand that museum deals take months, and you do not have months." Victor took a folder from his pocket. "You have 26 days left until the land is seized." He looked straight into her eyes. "When the bank takes the farm, all property will come under the creditor's control." He paused. "Including the automobile." The words hung in the air. Malone added slowly, "Therefore we have decided to improve our offer." He raised 2 fingers. $200,000 in cash. Eleanor looked at them for several seconds. She suddenly felt a strange calm. Earlier such sums had seemed incredible to her, but now she knew the truth. She slowly shook her head. "No." Victor frowned. "Pardon me?" "I said no." Malone narrowed his eyes slightly. "You are making a mistake. Perhaps you risk losing everything?" Eleanor looked at them calmly. "My husband did not work for 40 years, so that I would sell his labor for next to nothing." Malone chuckled. "You are an idealist." Eleanor pointed to the road. "And now I ask you to leave my land." For several seconds the men were silent, then Victor sharply closed the folder. "You will regret this." They turned and walked to the cars. A minute later the off-road vehicles disappeared around the bend. Eleanor slowly exhaled. Her hands trembled slightly. She returned to the house and opened the box of letters again. This time she took the next envelope for her 69th birthday. She knew it was still early, but she needed to hear Thomas's voice. She opened the letter. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you have already sold the Chaika, and I hope you did it correctly. But I want you to know one thing. I built this car not only to pay the debts. I did it to give you freedom. Freedom to live, freedom to dream. You always wanted to paint. I saw your drawings. You thought I did not notice how you sometimes drew in the kitchen. But I noticed. I wanted one day for you to be able to turn this old shed into your studio so you could live instead of just surviving. If the car helps you begin a new life, then everything was not in vain. I love you, Thomas." Eleanor sat for a long time with the letter in her hands. Thomas's words sounded in her head. He had never spoken about it aloud, but now she understood. He had thought not only about the debts, he had thought about her future. Eleanor took the telephone and dialed Irene's number. "Irene? Yes? I agree." On the other end of the line, there was a short pause. Then Irene said quietly, "You have made the right decision." The following week passed quickly. Lawyers, documents, photographs, contracts. Museum staff came to Altai to prepare the car for transport. One of them was a young man named Paul Carlson. Paul was about 30, tall and thin with tousled light brown hair and a kind smile. He was the museum engineer, and he treated the car almost with reverence. "Your husband did incredible work," he said to Eleanor, while they carefully prepared the Chaika for shipping. "I have seen restorations all over the world, but this is true art." A week later the deal was completed. $1 million. When the money arrived in the account, Eleanor stared at the computer screen for a long time. She still could not believe it. The next day she drove to the bank. Victor Anderson sat at his desk. When Eleanor entered, he raised his eyes and immediately understood. She placed the documents on the table. "My debt." He looked through the papers and turned pale. "You have paid everything?" He nodded slowly. "In that case, the seizure procedure is cancelled." Eleanor smiled. "Thank you." She turned and walked out. Outside it was cold, but for the first time in a long while she felt lightness. The shed still stood in its place, but now it was no longer a symbol of mystery. It had become a symbol of Thomas's love, love that had protected her even after his death. Spring came to Altai quietly and almost unnoticed. The snow melted and the earth began to breathe with the damp scent of grass and meltwater. The old shed on the edge of the farm still stood there, but now it looked different. Outside it was still rusty and old. The corrugated iron had darkened with time. The roof still sagged a little, but inside everything had changed. Eleanor Thompson stood in the middle of the space holding a brush. Sunlight fell through new windows in the roof. The light was soft and golden and filled the space with warmth. On the walls hung shelves with paints, on the floor lay rolls of canvas, and in the center stood a large easel. Thomas's shed had become an art studio. Eleanor looked for a long time at the almost finished canvas in front of her. The painting showed that very moment. The old shed, half darkness, and the chica under the tarp. The painting was filled with light and shadow. She ran the brush along the edge of the car's body. "That is how it is, Thomas," she said quietly. Several months had passed since the sale of the car. Life was gradually changing, but the main change had happened inside Eleanor herself. She no longer felt the weight that had pressed on her after her husband's death. Now she had a purpose. 1 week after the sale, Eleanor had created a charity foundation. She named it simply Thomas's Home. The idea had come to her unexpectedly. One evening she had sat in the kitchen sorting through her husband's old letters. In one of them he had written, "If one day you have more than you need, help those who find themselves in the same trouble." Those words had stayed in her mind. So Eleanor had decided to do exactly that. She had set aside $500,000 from the money received for the chica. That money became the foundation's base. The foundation helped farmers who had lost their spouses and found themselves on the brink of losing their land. The first family was the family of Nicholas Carter. Nicholas was a man about 40, tall and strong, with the rough hands of someone who had worked the land all his life. His thick reddish beard was always slightly unkempt and his eyes looked tired. 1 year earlier his wife had died of illness. He was left alone with 2 children and debts for agricultural machinery. When Eleanor first came to him, Nicholas could hardly look her in the eye. "I am not used to accepting help," he said. "This is not help," Eleanor answered gently. "This is a chance." The foundation helped pay part of his debts and the land remained with the family. Such stories grew more and more. Within a few months, the foundation had already helped 10 families in the Altai region. People began to talk about Eleanor, but she did not seek fame. She simply did what she thought Thomas would have done. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, an exhibition was being prepared. Irene Brooks often called Eleanor. "You must come to the opening," she said. And in the end, Eleanor agreed. The trip to St. Petersburg was her first in many years. The city seemed huge, cold, but beautiful to her. The Museum of Automotive History was in an old brick building. When Eleanor entered, Irene met her. "Welcome." They walked through several halls and stopped in front of a glass platform. There stood the chica, polished and lit by soft light. Beside it hung a plaque. Eleanor read the text.
Gastirtin Sheka.
Restoration by Thomas Thompson. 40 years of work for the future of his wife. Her eyes filled with tears. "He would be proud," Irene said quietly. Eleanor nodded. She took a package from her bag. "I also have a gift for the museum." She unwrapped the cloth. It was her painting. The very one. The shed and the chica under the tarp. Irene looked at it for a long time. "It is beautiful." The painting took its place beside the car. So Thomas's story became even more alive. When Eleanor returned to Altai, life continued to change. The farm came alive. She began to plant flowers along the road. In spring, the field around the house was covered with red poppies and yellow buttercups. People from neighboring villages began to come to her. Some simply to talk, some to ask for advice, and sometimes children came. The first was a little girl named Anna Kowalski. She was 10 years old. She had fair pigtails and huge, curious eyes. She stood at the door of the shed and asked shyly, "May I watch you paint?" Eleanor smiled. Of course. Gradually more and more children came. On Saturdays the shed filled with voices. Children sat at small tables and drew fields, mountains, animals. Sometimes they drew that very chica about which the whole neighborhood already knew. Local people began to call Eleanor's story by a special name. The Miracle of the Rusty Shed. But Eleanor knew the truth. It was not a miracle. It was Thomas's love. In the evenings when the children left, Eleanor often remained alone in the studio. On the wall hung a photograph of their wedding, and beside it a frame with an envelope. It was the last letter for her 83rd birthday. She had never opened it. Sometimes Eleanor approached it and ran a finger over the paper but did not unseal it. She liked the thought that ahead there were still words from Thomas, that his voice was still waiting for her in the future. One evening she stood at the window of the studio. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the wind softly rustled the grass. Eleanor looked at the shed and smiled. Thomas had truly kept his promise. He had protected her even after death. But the greatest gift he had left her was much simpler. The certainty that true love never disappears. It continues to live in deeds, in people, in hope. In life it often seems that everything is lost. Sometimes one bad harvest, one illness, one loss can destroy years of labor. But this story reminds us of a simple truth. God sometimes hides a miracle where we least expect to find it. An old rusty shed, an old car, an old key in a drawer. For others it was just rubbish, but for Eleanor it became the answer to a prayer she had not even had time to utter. Sometimes love sown years earlier begins to bear fruit when it seems already too late. Thomas left this world, but his care, his patience, and his love continued to protect Eleanor even after his death. And perhaps that is one of God's quiet miracles. True love does not disappear. It continues to live and act. Therefore, if today difficulties have come into your life, do not lose hope. Sometimes behind the heaviest door a gift is already prepared that God has made ready for you. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. Share this story with those who need hope today. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss new stories about Eleanor, love, and real miracles. May God bless you and your home. May there always be light, hope, and people who truly love you in your life.